And so Solomon begins by telling us that life isn't fair. But then he makes a second statement, and that is we should trust God's judgment. We should trust God's judgment. He says in verse 17, I said in my heart. Think of that. He's talking to himself. He's reasoning within himself. I said it in my heart, not out loud. I'm thinking this in my mind. Where there's injustice and there's unfairness, I said in my heart. The next three words you should highlight, you should underline, you should bold them. God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. I said in my heart. There he is. He's reasoning again. He's thinking within himself. He's talking to himself. I said in my heart concerning the condition of the sons of men, God tests them, that they may see that they themselves are like animals. Now I want to begin with that second verse, verse 18, and come back to verse 17. Do you know what he's saying in verse 18? When he says he uses these injustices, these unfairnesses of life to test mankind, that they may see that they all by themselves are like animals. You hear what he's saying? Living in an unjust world without God means we sometimes become beast-like in action and in reaction. Think about it for a moment. You come to a four-way stop. You're on the left. The car that comes at the exact same moment is on the right. You know, being the car on the right, that you have the right of way. But somebody sitting behind the wheel to the left of you decides that they're going to press ahead and they're going to get out before you can get out. And they rush forward, quickly going through the four-way stop. And it's happened to you not once, but it's happened to you many times. And you look at it and you think, if I had a truck, an old beat-up truck, and suddenly the beast-like character begins to come out from within us, right? That beast-like character begins to reveal itself. Or think about the times that you stood in line somewhere, maybe at an amusement park, maybe at a bank, and maybe at some place where you were trying to get in a restaurant, and somebody walks up and they walk around and they break in the line. They begin a conversation with somebody that's up front, and then they just stay in that place. And you behind them, that beast-like nature begins to reveal itself. God allows the injustices and the injustices and the unfairnesses of life. God allows it to reveal those beast-like character, that beast-like quality that's within all of us. What do we want to do to that person who breaks the line? Think about the mother, true story, of the cheerleader whose daughter didn't make the cheering squad. And so she plotted how to kill the daughter, the girl that took her place. God uses the injustices and the unfairnesses of life to expose what we think of as the injustices and the unfairnesses, to expose the beast-like qualities that dwell within all of us, because all of us are sinners. You've thought of some of those things. I was watching, I don't know if it was the National Geographic Channel or if it was Animal Planet. I can't remember which of the channels I was watching, the documentary about wild animals. They were doing a documentary of wild animals in their habitat. And this particular one had to do with a pride of lions. And they were laying in wait for what was a herd of zebra, sometimes called a dazzle of zebra. They were lying in wait, trying to find the right moment, and then they find the weakest amongst them. And they lash out, and several of them take after the weakest amongst them, and they bring him down or her down, and they begin to kill and destroy so they can eat. I thought about one of our cats. We had two cats, Pishi and Sheba. We were privileged to live with them. They allowed us to stay in the house, and we appreciated that dearly. But One of them was allowed to go out and come in. The other always stayed in. And I can remember one of those cats coming home with a dead mouse between its teeth. I'm sure the cat came back thinking, they'll be proud of me. Look what I've caught. Look what I've done. I've saved you from having to scream because the mouse is dead. But what do animals do? Animals act like animals. Animals behave like animals. Think about the fox and the hare. The fox chases that rabbit wherever he goes until he can catch that rabbit. That's how animals behave. That's why you see the lawlessness in the land today. People acting like animals, responding like animals. And God says, I allow the injustice and I allow the unfairness of life to expose what is really in the heart of mankind. Some of you can think of somebody you'd like to punch in the face. I'd like to give them one good slug in the face. But Solomon says you need to trust God's judgment. Notice verse 17, I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there. You remember what he said in verse 1 of chapter 3? There's a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. Well, there is a time there amongst the times and seasons of life. There is a time when God will judge. God will hold mankind responsible for the way he or she responds to the given circumstances of life. God will hold us. If we're believers, we'll be held accountable at the judgment seat of Christ. If you're an unbeliever, you'll be held account at the great white throne judgment. But we will be held account. And what he says is, rather than you acting like a beast and behaving like a beast, what you ought to do is leave the judgment to God. Have you discovered that you have a hard time meting out justice in a just fashion? Because you have the tendency toward partiality. Just like every other sinful human being has partiality toward that sinful nature, that beast-like nature. God says, you leave that to me. I want you to turn with me to Romans chapter 12. Listen to how God says we're supposed to deal with the injustices of life. People who treat us wrongly and treat us unfairly. How should that florist on the West Coast respond to those who are treating her so unjustly and unfairly? Romans chapter 12, verse 17 says it. Verse 17, repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Not like the beast of the field. It's a dog-eat-dog kind of environment. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with what? With good. Trust God's judgment. Some of you are angry. Some of you are angry at things that are happening to you, happening in your life. Some of you are angry at a former spouse. You're angry at a former employer. You're angry at a neighbor in your neighborhood. You're angry. You're angry. And that beast-like nature rises up within you. I'm going to get even. And Solomon says this world is a world that is filled with injustice and unfairness. He acknowledges that it exists, and then he says, God shall judge. You know, if you walk past a courthouse or a courtroom, probably somewhere, you'll see Lady Justice, won't you? Have you seen her? She's wearing a blindfold. She's in one hand has the scales where the evidence is going to be weighed. And in the other hand, she has the sword, because when the evidence weighs against, the sword of justice is going to fall. But she's not supposed to be looking with preferential treatment. She's not supposed to be looking through the bribe that somebody's given to her. She's not supposed to be looking because of the color of your skin or your economic background or where you live in a community. But the reality is, the only one who can judge in that kind of a perfect manner is the perfect one, the God of heaven. Are you suggesting, Pastor, that if there's something, a recourse for me by way of the law, that I shouldn't take that? That's not at all what I'm saying. But where the law can't do any more for you, you don't take the law into your own hands. You don't take the law into your own hands. We like to walk around and bang our chest and talk about, I got this many guns. We'll take you down. You come to me. You don't find that anywhere in the Bible. You don't overcome evil with more evil. You overcome evil with good. Paul Harvey used to tell the story about a man named Gary Tyndall. He was charged with robbery, and he was standing in the California courtroom of Judge Armando Rodriguez. Tyndall asked permission to go to the bathroom, and he was escorted there, and there was a guard put outside to watch the door, but Tyndall was determined to escape. He climbed up the plumbing, he lifted a panel in the ceiling of the bathroom, and he started crawling overhead, headed south. Going to get out of that building. He went about 30 feet when the ceiling gave way, and he dropped to the floor right back in Judge Rodriguez's courtroom. It may look like people are getting away, but they haven't been to the final courtroom yet. Numbers 32:23 says, "Be sure your sin will find you out." Paul said in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 to 9, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life. And let us not grow weary in doing good. For in due season we will reap if we do not give up." God is the ultimate judge. Life isn't always fair, is it? He says, trust God's judgment. His third statement is death is certain. Verse 19, I won't get through all of these. Verse 19, he says, "For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them, as one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity." Now here, you should have some advantage here. Unlike what he says here, you should have some advantage here, because you've had a preacher stand here and tell you what is the interpretive principle of this book. What is it? Solomon is seeing life where? Under the sun. And the fact of the matter is, when that's your only perspective, when that's all you can see, it certainly looks like man and animal ends up in the same place, because they both get put in the ground. They both have breath to breathe. They both have life in their lungs. But when it's gone, they're gone. Our cats are buried in a yard, and so are my parents and other members of my family. And that's how it appears when you look at life under the sun. You understand that by empirical research, you cannot determine what comes after this life. You can't determine it by what you observe. You can only determine it by the revelation of God. You can look and study all you want. Doctors can look. I saw one time an article where they supposedly weighed the body of somebody before they died and after they died, and I forget what the number was, but a few grams difference existed between those two. And somebody said, that means that's the exit of the soul. The soul must have weighed that many grams. My soul weighs a lot more grams than that, apparently. You can't, by empirical research, determine, just by observation, looking around you at life under the sun, and that's all you see. People who don't know God, who don't believe this book, who don't understand the revelation of God, who can't look up and see that there's a creator God in heaven, they will never understand that there's any difference between the way men die and animals die. It's the reason why your children are taught every single year that they evolved from a lower life form. Their death is no better than the death of any other animal. And Solomon says death is certain. It's absolutely certain. Both animal and human beings die. As one dies, so dies the other. I've got news for you. Your pets may live 7 or 10 or 14 or 20 years, but they're going to die, and you may live 70 or 80 or 90 or I hope all of you 100 years and have your minds, but you're going to die. How foolish is it to live only for this life, but when that's all you can see, that's all you understand, right? From the purely humanistic perspective, that's how things appear. The answer about what happens after death isn't found through human observation. It's only found through divine revelation. Aren't we thankful that we have the completed Bible? And we hear Jesus say to his disciples in the upper room, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way you know." And Thomas said, "Lord, we don't know where you're going, and how can we know the way?" And Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by me." How do we know there's a heaven? Because we've got a Bible that's inspired, because we got a God that's revealed it. That's how we know there's a heaven. Death is certain. Hebrews 9:27 says it's appointed unto man once to die. But after this, what does he say? The judgment, the judgment. You understand that there's significant difference between mankind and the animal kingdom. Mankind is made in the image of God. The animal kingdom is not. Mankind has a spirit that is God conscious. The animal kingdom does not. Mankind has eternity written in their hearts. The animal kingdom does not. When Hebrews says there's an appointed time to die, and after this the judgment, the only thing most people ever think about is the death that they'll have to die. They never think about the judgment that's to come. I'm reminded of a doctor who's a medical doctor who's a Christian himself. And he once said that many people tell me they're afraid of dying, but no one has ever said they're afraid of the judgment that comes after death. But you better stop and think about it. Look with me to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, and I'm going to finish here. I'll come back to these other points later. Luke chapter 12. Are y'all with me? Luke chapter 12, verses 16 to 21. Listen, you better think about more than this life, because while your teachers in the college classroom may have told you that you're just an advanced form of some mammal, some advanced form of another form that existed before, and you have evolved to who you are today, that you're nothing more than an animal yourself. Is it any wonder why our kids act the way they act? Why they conduct themselves in the fashion they conduct themselves? Why they do some of the things that they do? When you tell them they're animals, Why not act like an animal? When you tell them they're the design of the Creator God, made in His image with a spirit and eternity in their hearts, that changes everything. People say it doesn't matter where I send my kids to school. It absolutely matters where you send your kids to school, because they're teaching your children not just science and math and history, they're teaching them a worldview. And the reason we lose so many kids out of college age is because we send them to secular colleges and they get their minds and they change their worldview to something that is anti-God. I've gone to meddling now. Luke chapter 12, verse 16. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. That's good. We love that, don't we? And he thought within himself. You remember who Solomon was talking to? He's talking to himself. He thought within himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, by the way, it's not a good idea to talk to yourself. That can put you in an institution. So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. He's only thinking about this life. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. I've got my retirement plan. I know where I'm going to spend the last years of my life. And when I get too sick to take care of myself, it's paid for me to be in a personal care home until hospice comes in and I get called out of the world. Verse 20. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided? Did you hear Solomon say that earlier when we were studying? I mean, I've worked for all of these things. I've done all of this. I've got it all amassed, and I'm going to die. And I don't know who's going to come behind me, whether they're going to appreciate what I've done or they're going to carry it on, whether they're going to do something good with it. I don't know what's going to happen to it after I die. This man dies. Verse 21, so is he who lays up treasure for himself and here's the above the sun perspective, is not rich toward God. Do you hear what I'm saying? I know it's not a popular thing to say anymore, but I've reached the age where I don't really care much anymore what everybody says. I don't have long left anyway. You can vote me out. I can retire if I have to. Not that I've tailored what I said prior to this. How sad it is that we live as though this is all there is and there's nothing more. Death is certain. He says two other things, and I want to mention them to you. Fourthly, naturalism, he says, leads to despair. Naturalism leads to despair. What do you mean by naturalism, preacher? It means that nature is all there is and God doesn't exist outside of nature, if at all. In other words, all that we have is what we can see, touch, feel, and experience in this life. And that's precisely the viewpoint of Solomon in this book. And it brings him, verse 21, to say, who knows? Who knows? When all you have is observation and you don't have revelation, who knows? The spirit of the sons of men, which goes upward, and the spirit of the animal which goes down to the earth. Who knows what happens after you die? And those words, who know, express the absolute despair. Who knows? I don't know. I want to know. I don't know what's going to happen. What's going to happen? Who knows? At the end of verse 22, he says, for who can bring him to see what will happen after him? Nobody can do that but God. But if you can't see anything but what's immediately around you and you've discounted God altogether, you can't see what revelation can provide for you. You can only see what observation can provide you. And it is never enough. But then the final one is make the best of your life. What does he say in verse 22? So I perceived, that is, I see, I saw. He's not talking to himself now. He's looking. So I perceived, I see, I saw that nothing is better than that a man should rejoice in his own works, for that is his heritage. Let me close with this illustration. According to a Russian legend, there was a peasant that was going to receive by a deed all the land he could encompass by running in one day. When that day came, he ran and ran and ran, and he got back to the starting point at the end of the day, and he was tired, but the sun still wasn't down. At least it wasn't quite all the way down. So he took off in another direction to acquire some more land, and he got back just as the sun dropped below the horizon, and he dropped dead. All that running to acquire all that land. And when he got back to the starting point with all the land now his, he dropped dead. That's the picture of the futility of modern living. People gain something, but they can't enjoy it. They work for wealth, but then they lose it. And Solomon says we need to stop and stop and smell the roses. Stop trying to have a house as big as somebody else's house, cars as nice as somebody else's cars. Stop competing with everybody else and stop and enjoy the blessings of God that are already around you.